It's now time to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kelly Dock. Dr. Dock received her bachelor's degree from Duke University before attending medical school at the University of Kentucky College of Medicine. She completed her residency in pediatrics at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. She is a professor of pediatrics, working for over 20 years as a pediatric hospitalist with the Norton Children's Medical Group affiliated with the University of Louisville. Dr. Dock is a member of the No-Hit Zone Committee with a strategic plan to end corporal punishment across the spectrum of prevention. She chairs the Norton Children's Hospital Child Abuse Task Force and has been recognized by the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children and the Kentucky chapter of the AAP for her work on no-hit zones. So welcome, Dr. Dock. She will be talking to us about a review of corporal punishment and no-hit zones. Turn it over to you, Dr. Dock.
Great, thanks. And thanks everyone for joining us over the lunch hour to discuss everyone's favorite topic, corporal punishment. I think it's a great topic for kicking off Child Abuse Prevention Month here in April, but I acknowledge that it can be a tough topic to talk about. And so I always start this lecture by just saying that up front, that I know we all approach this issue with different it oftentimes brings up big feelings, right? And we all have different personal experience or not potentially with this topic, different professional backgrounds in terms of the tools we have in our toolbox surrounding this issue. And sometimes it can make people feel uncomfortable to approach this topic. So again, thank you for your commitment to spending this time considering it. And I hope I can offer possibly some new information and some new tools for your toolbox in how you might approach this with families. I also would love to learn from you, whether it's at the end of the talk or whether it's via correspondence later on, because I know that many of us have been doing this for a number of years, and I would love to learn from you as well in the ways that you've approached this with families and what's worked and what hasn't and what concerns you might have. As was said in the pre-show, I don't have any disclosures. We'll talk a little bit about trends, research, and policy statements related to corporal punishment and talk about some common myths or justifications that families oftentimes bring up with regard to corporal punishment, and then talk a bit about alternatives. And then a lot of the work that I've done on this topic is with no-hit zones, and then potentially expansion of no-hit zones to homes and schools. And I'll talk about a little bit of my background and how I started working on this particular topic. I'd worked hard in medical school, I'd worked hard in residency, I was ready to do this attending job. And I found myself in a primary care clinic on the corner of Floyd and Broadway in Louisville, and recognized that as an attending now, I had to set the tone in the office. And I was looked to as the expert who was supposed to know the answers to all the questions. And, I knew readily what to do for lots of things. My training had really left me well equipped to help with that kid who had status asthmaticus or the child who came in and started seizing. I knew what to do. But what happened to me is I realized that I just did not have tools in my toolbox. I really received zero education on how to address this particular topic. And I hope that we're doing better with that with our residents now in their training. I think we are. But I personally really did not have tools in my toolbox. And so what would happen is I would be in the back hallway. At that time, we actually wrote on paper charts. So you can imagine, I'm writing, and typically hitting wasn't the first thing I would encounter. I would sort of hear that escalation. I would hear that voice of a caregiver bringing their kids to the back, right, from the front. And I'd hear this, you better step up on that scale. You better hurry up or I'm going to whoop you, right? And so what would happen is, sort of the hair would stand up on the back of my neck, and I kind of start looking around for my more seasoned partners. Surely one of them would come and handle this, or surely Mel, who knew all the families in the clinic because she'd worked there forever, surely she would come and approach the situation and sort of diffuse it. but that's not what always happened. And sometimes it would escalate to the point of hitting. And frankly, in those early years, I would sort of bury my head in the chart and keep writing and just kind of pretend it wasn't there. But what I realized is that I really had an obligation to figure out how to put language around this and put tools around this and how to approach it. And so that's kind of how my journey started with this. And it's expanded a lot since then. But I hope that this can put some tools in your toolboxes. And again, please add to my toolbox. I don't have all the answers for every situation you might encounter, but I hope that this will be helpful. So what are we talking about when we're talking about corporal punishment? Because really the definition refers to a broad range of potential activities. So it's really any punishment in which physical force is intended to cause pain as a means of modifying behavior. So primarily throughout the course of this talk, I'm going to be talking about good old-fashioned spanking. So smacking, hitting, tapping, swatting, popping, switching, whatever you want to call it. The common denominator of all of those things really is hitting. And I will somewhat purposefully interchange those words, hitting, spanking, etc., because I think they refer to sort of the same practice. But it can refer, corporal punishment generally can refer to a broader range of activities. So hot sauce in the mouth or needing to be in a painful position for a period of time. And so it really is an umbrella term. And so Finkelhor really has published some fairly recent data about how common spanking is. And so there are prior studies about once a decade, and we're sort of due for some updated information here soon. But essentially, these are cross-sectional telephone surveys of nationally representative households. And so just asking the question, and in this graph, we're looking at households who have kids ages 0 to 9, and just saying, how have you spanked in the last year? And so what we see over time is definitely a decrease. So 77% of households with kids 0 to 9 years of age reporting spanking in the prior year back in the 70s. To the 2010s, a drop to 49%. In older kids, the numbers are a bit less. So 23% in the 2010s for those 10 to 17-year-olds. And so overall, taken all kids 0 to 18 years of age, a report of 37% of kids being hit in the prior year. So suffice it to say, it's still quite common. I would say it's part of our social norm, continues into the 2020s. And then if we look by age, so the percent by age spanked in the previous year, I want to point out a couple of trends. So infants, so kids less than 1 year of age, about 8% of households with those kids report using spanking. The percent increases, particularly over the toddler years, right? Those sort of 2 to 4 years of age to over 60%, and then stays above 50% until about 9 years of age, where it sort of trails off. And so when I'm looking at this, a few things stick out. So number one, infants are being hit. And so if in my primary care practice, I was waiting to talk to families about this topic until kids are 18 months or 2 years of age, I'm potentially missing a lot of hitting that's happening at an earlier age. So I think that's one thing to really consider. The other thing that I have found in my practice is that typically spanking occurs when there is really a mismatch between caregiver expectations of a child's behavior and their level of development. And so it made it really clear to me that we can reduce escalating situations that may result in spanking by spending a lot of time with families, when we're doing well child checkups in terms of learning about growth and development. And honestly, even from that very first visit or even prenatally, helping equip families to have realistic expectations. So Finkelhor reports geographic variability in spanking, so reduced rates in the northeastern part of the country and the far west, with the highest rates in the southeastern parts of the United States. And he suggests several explanations for this. Number one, it very much mirrors school corporal punishment. So the 17 states where school corporal punishment is still permitted are again sort of congregated in that southeastern region. And also, perhaps mirrors a disproportionate population of conservative Christian groups. And I am not a theologian, I am not an expert in religion, but I've done a fair amount of reading about the religious argument for spanking, and so we'll talk about that a bit later. Finkelhor also reports on racial variability in spanking, so whites and Hispanic reporting lower rates of spanking than African Americans. And he suggests that some possible explanations for this are intergenerational remainders of slavery and race-based violence and how that impacts parents' perceived need for immediate control. And then Finkelhor also points out caregiver education and its association with spanking. And so caregivers with a graduate degree tend to spank less than those with college, some college, high school, or less, and suggests that perhaps this is in relation to more exposure to professional opinion and social science literature. And then family structure and spanking. So really similar rates of spanking reported, whether it's a one-parent household or a two-parent household. However, the number of children seems to play a role. So one-child families report lower rates of spanking at 43% overall. And those percentages increase with the number of children. So two children households are at 50%, three children at 55%, and then four or more children at 56%. And so suggestions Finkelhor proposes include perhaps delayed child rearing, more time to find alternatives, etc. Okay. So suffice it to say that corporal punishment is still very much a part of our social norm. And this question was asked of adults. So do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree that it is sometimes necessary to discipline a child with a good hard spank? And so we can see this trend over time with 84% of adults either strongly agreeing or agreeing with this statement back in the 60s to now still around that 56% mark. So still over half of adults agreeing. So a decrease though, right? A significant decrease over time. And then this newer data, and these slides have been taken with permission from Elizabeth Gershoff, and I'll refer to her work a little bit later in this topic, this talk. She really is widely published on corporal punishment. And so this particular study asked for parents to rate on whether physical punishment terms are more or less severe than hitting. And so it's interesting when we look at these different words, tap, swat, spank, pop, and smack are felt to be less severe than hitting, but slapping, whooping, punching, and beating are felt to be more severe than hitting. So, and I think I would say that's true in the families that I've worked with. It's oftentimes the way I ask the question. So, do you hit your children? Well, no. Do you spank your children? Well, yeah, right? And so those terms, the nuance in the terms can be important in trying to sort things out. And so, how it's interesting to note. So this is another study that essentially looks at the percent of parents who agreed that hitting different types of family members is acceptable. And what I'll point out is when they asked, is it acceptable for a parent to hit their child? 30% agreed with that statement. When it comes to the dog, is it acceptable for a man to hit his dog? Only 17% agreed that that's acceptable. So again, just trying to put this topic into context as a social norm. So parents in this particular study think that hitting children is more acceptable than hitting the dog. I'm not going to talk a lot about school corporal punishment today. It is something that I've worked a lot on, and we've had some really good progress in the state of Kentucky. And while it's still legal by statute in the state of Kentucky in public schools, the Kentucky Department of Education has passed a regulation that has resulted in now all public school districts across the state of Kentucky coming up with policies that there is not any corporal punishment. So that's been really exciting, important work that's occurred over the last several years with a lot of different partners. But it's still legal in 17 US states. The most recent states that abolished it were Idaho and Colorado back in 2024. And the largest concentration, again, is in the southernmost states. So Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi have the highest use of school corporal punishment. So, when I'm going to look for information on how I should advise patients and families, I think all of us likely go to the American Academy of Pediatrics, and they have been really clear on the school corporal punishment topic for a long time and have a policy that it should not be used. Really, end of story. Um, what was a little bit fuzzy until this particular policy statement update in 2018 is corporal punishment use by parents slash caregivers within the home. Because the 1998 policy, suggested that pediatricians should help parents explore alternatives. Whereas this 2018 language is really clear that parents should not use corporal punishment, including hitting and spanking, either in anger or as a punishment for or consequence of misbehavior. And I will say that this particular document is highly evidence-based. And if you have not had a chance to read it in full, I would highly suggest that you do so. I think it's just really informative and helpful in talking about this issue. Part of that policy statement suggests that parenting advice from us as pediatricians may include, effective discipline strategies, information on the harms and ineffectiveness of corporal punishment, and then the notion that spanking may result in long-term harms and is not necessary. And I hope I can provide some additional detail about that if it's not something that you've looked up recently. And then we too are called upon as advocates for public awareness, education, and outreach to increase public knowledge of the effects of physical discipline and then also increase knowledge about alternatives. And the American Psychological Association and many other professional organizations that work with children and families have similar policy statements about corporal punishment. And in fact, the CDC's technical package for preventing child abuse and neglect actually has had a change in its definition of physical abuse that I think illustrates this sort of change in thinking about corporal punishment. So the change is the inclusion of the word hitting. So physical abuse is the intentional use of physical force, such as hitting, kicking, shaking, burning, or other shows of force against a child. As part of that preventing child abuse and neglect technical package, I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of these elements. So changing social norms to support parents and positive parenting, including legislative approaches to reducing corporal punishment. Also enhancing parenting skills with early childhood home visitation, parenting skill and family relationship approaches. And these are different areas that certainly we are looked to as experts in helping families navigate how to develop their parenting skills. We can also make referrals to home visitation programs, etc. And so, who do parents go to when they're looking for professional advice regarding child discipline and corporal punishment. So Kathy Taylor is well published on this particular topic as well. And so she published a paper looking at this specifically. And so pediatricians, 48%, we are the highest on the ladder here in terms of being sought out for professional advice. Religious leaders are the second most sought after professional, and then also mental health professionals. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I'm not going to present all of the research on corporal punishment that is out there because, frankly, that could be an entire day symposium. But I'm going to highlight several of the research articles that seem to really resonate with families and in hopes that this will add to your toolbox. So this first one is a study out of Harvard that looked at MRI images in young adults and looked at two groups. One group who had received corporal punishment at least once a month, and the other group which had not. And what they found is kids spanked once a month had 14 to 19% smaller brains in the decision-making areas. So I'm talking about the prefrontal cortex. So actual change in the structure and robustness of that particular area of the brain associated with corporal punishment. And as you all know, that prefrontal cortex is really important and is responsible for things like impulse control, executive functioning, judgment, learning, modifying behavior, inferring, thinking, and feeling. And so it's really a key area for higher cognitive functioning. Another older study by Strauss, who also is widely published, looked at spanking and its association with change in IQ points. And so when we look at toddlers in that 2 to 4-year-old age group and compare two groups, one who was spanked and one wasn't, the group who was spanked, as that plays out, tend to have 5 fewer IQ points in testing later on. And kids ages 5 to 9, also a reduction in IQ points to a slightly lesser extent, around just under 3 fewer IQ points. So again, this link between spanking and cognitive impacts. And then if you want to look at the meta-analysis, and so this was done by Liz Gershoff, so it pooled 88 studies over 62 years. And the strongest relationship that was found is a very strong relationship between corporal punishment and physical abuse. And so there are associations actually between corporal punishment and lots of negative health outcomes, including things like increased aggression, antisocial behavior, mental health problems, negative parent relationships, lower cognitive abilities and self-esteem, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the tightest association was between corporal punishment and physical abuse. Now, that is not to say that everyone who is spanked is abused, right? That's not what this is saying. But as a pediatrician, when I look at these associations, it suggests to me that I want to recommend things that are going to reduce the risk of all the things on this list to patients and families that I work with, right? And so in terms of risk reduction, I have to recommend against corporal punishment in the same way that I recommend against smoking. Not everyone who grew up in a household with a smoker develops lung cancer, but we know we can significantly reduce the risk by eliminating smoking in the household, right? And if you look this up, you'll notice that there was a second meta-analysis done in 2016. And the reason that second meta-analysis was done is there was some criticism of the initial meta-analysis and its inclusion of older articles with more harsh forms of spanking, so using an implement and those kinds of things. And so the question was, do these relationships still hold up when we eliminate those studies with harsher forms of corporal punishment? So in short, does good old-fashioned spanking, do these associations still occur? And the answer is yes, to a slightly lesser degree, but yes, they do hold up. And so again, we want to recommend things that lower the risk. And I think we have a real opportunity to take a stand against hitting children. I'll also highlight this more recent article. So this is actually a picture of Liz Gershoff. And so this was published in The Lancet actually quite recently. And essentially, this looked at 69 prospective longitudinal studies. And really, the goal of this sort of narrative review was to create a document to inform both practitioners and policymakers about physical punishment outcomes. And I won't talk about all of the themes, but several that I wanted to highlight include that corporal punishment predicts increased behavior problems over time. It is not associated with any positive outcomes. It increases the risk of CPS involvement, and there is some evidence that there's a dose-dependent relationship. Here's a table that's pulled from her article, again, just highlighting that with over 90 effect sizes that were investigated, none showed beneficial outcomes of physical punishment. And I'll switch gears now to discussing a little bit about the international perspective on corporal punishment. I won't spend too long on it, but really the US is pretty out of step with the international climate. You may or may not be familiar with the Convention on the Rights of the Child with the United Nations. This is back from the late 1980s. And essentially, all countries in the United Nations, with the exception of the US, have ratified this comprehensive treaty that talks about child rights generally. And you know, the US is in keeping with most of the elements of this particular treaty because its goal was to protect child welfare generally. So child rights, freedom from violence and exploitation, access to education and healthy development, and all these sorts of things. You know, in the United States, many of the components that the UN addressed are left to the states. And many states are compliant when it comes to things like child marriage, right? Child labor and juvenile justice and this sort of thing. And I'll just read a little bit from you about from one of the articles of this international treaty. So, the CRC, Convention on the Rights of the Child, requires states to protect children from all forms of physical and mental violence. The Committee on the Rights of the Child affirms that the CRC, Convention on the Rights of the Child, does not leave room for any level of legalized violence against children, and that corporal punishment and other cruel and degrading forms of punishment are forms of violence, and states, meaning countries, must take all appropriate legislative, administrative, social, and educational measures to eliminate them. So I'll switch gears now again and just talk a little bit about the different justifications that I have heard from families and caregivers for the use of corporal punishment. And again, I would love anyone who wants to comment in the chat to hear more about the ways that you've approached these issues. And so you might guess the ones that are going to pop up here. I might spank them, but I would never abuse or injure my child, right? So that one, I would never kind of let it get out of hand. I was spanked and turned out fine, right? The spare the rod, spoil the child, so the religious argument. And then kids these days, they're running wild. And the reason is we've all gone soft, right? No one's spanking anymore. So we can talk about each of those in turn. So the first one, I would never abuse or injure my child. So I think this pictorial is really helpful when I think about this particular justification. And so we see on the left-hand side of this physical harm continuum, things like shoving, mild slapping. And then on the right side, things more like bruising, first-degree burns, broken bones. Because what's tricky is sort of where do things cross the line in terms of physical punishment? Because most of our laws actually have a fair amount of subjectivity. And so we find ourselves in this gray zone where there's no clear agreed upon point where it crosses the line. And so I'll read to you a little bit from Kentucky statute. So Kentucky statute prohibits corporal punishment, which is, quote, designed to cause or known to create a substantial risk of causing death, serious physical injury, disfigurement, extreme pain, or extreme mental distress. So you can tell that those subjective words like extreme and serious make it a little bit tricky and put us in a gray zone because what's extreme to me might not be extreme to you. And what's serious to me may not be serious to you. And I think in the medical community, really the presence of injury or the significant risk of injury has kind of been used as that line. Um, but we don't consider this particular continuum when we're thinking about adults, right? Like it's not okay for my boss at work if I haven't finished my charts to slightly shove or mildly slap me, right? Like those aren't acceptable responses. Um, and I'll just add that typically violence isn't occurring in a vacuum. And so we know that in about 55% of households where we find intimate partner violence, that there is current child maltreatment occurring in those households. And, um, you know, the use of spanking in the setting of considering intimate partner violence. So the spanking is usually followed by some sort of reassurance of love, maybe significantly later, but it does parallel that whole cycle of domestic violence. And so what happens, by using spanking and corporal punishment, it is in some ways teaching children that it's okay for adults who love them to hurt their bodies. And how does that play out when those kids grow up and develop their own intimate partner relationships, potentially encounter violence, then with reassurances of love? And you can imagine how this cycle of violence continues. I'll also just add there have been pretty not insignificant reports of non-disclosure of sexual abuse for kids who experience physical punishment because of fear of physical punishment occurring if they disclose. So there are linkages. Okay, so this is Liz Gershoff again, and essentially the longest green bar, shows the strongest association between corporal punishment and physical abuse, with shorter bars for those other negative health outcomes that we already discussed. And this little guy down here in the corner reminds me to discuss, when, a smack on the hand is used to stop this child from playing with the light socket, is it really teaching him what is desired by the parent? So what I would want to teach that child is that the light socket's dangerous and you shouldn't play with it, not that you don't play with the light socket so that mom doesn't hurt your hand, right? Because then what happens when I'm not in the room, right? They're right back to playing with the light socket because I haven't really taught them what I wanted to teach. Okay. So this whole I would never abuse, injure my child. I just want to point out one Canadian study, and it looked at, no doubt about it, substantiated cases of maltreatment, so with injury, and found that over 75% of those substantiated cases occurred with an episode of physical punishment. So that idea of a whooping gone bad or things escalating to the point where injury occurred, right? And so I firmly believe that parents who spank and use physical punishment, they don't enter into any particular episode with the intent to cause injury or to abuse their child. I mean, I firmly believe that. But certainly it increases the risk, right? So again, not all children who are spanked are abused, and not all children who grow up in that smoking home end up with lung cancer. But as pediatricians, I want to recommend to families eliminating the use of a practice which could potentially result in significant harms. How about this one? So, well, I was spanked and turned out fine. I mean, I think think I'm doing okay, right? I was spanked one time. I remember it very clearly. But I think it's helpful when we look at some other social norms that have changed over time to help us put this one into context and how we might talk about it, and also how folks may be receptive to change over time. So obviously, this is a picture of a baby face down in a crib with lots of extra bumpers and sheets and whatnot. And so I suspect that if I ask people to raise their hands, many of us may have also been put to sleep on our bellies. I know that I was. My mom loved me, and if I vomited in the middle of the night, she did not want me to choke and die. She thought she was doing the safest thing for me. But certainly, this is not what we recommend to patients and families now, right? There are lots of aspects of safe sleep. And we recommend those newer techniques because we have really great evidence that we decrease the risk of sudden unexpected infant death by practicing all of those elements of safe sleep. So, a social norm that has very much changed over time. All right. How about this one? Anyone ever ridden in the back of a pickup truck or ridden in a car without a seatbelt? I know for me, my grandmother lived in Florida. I grew up in Kentucky, and my brother and sister and I would get in the car with my mom and drive down to Florida to see my grandma every year for spring break. And the fight was always who was going to get to ride on the hump in the back of the car. And I can promise you, the hump did not have a seatbelt, right? And so I suspect this is one that may resonate with you. And we have lots and lots of new laws and regulations about car seats, about booster seats, about seat belts, and all of those things that we know help reduce the risk of death or serious injury in a motor vehicle collision, right? So lots of different advice to families that may not have been as prevalent as it was back in the 70s, even 80s, right? I mean, I think I would be judged if I was driving a pickup truck around my neighborhood with my kids in the back at this point in time, especially as a pediatrician in the community. But there's good research to suggest that this is important. All right, how about this one? So this shows my age. There was one time where we got to fly to Florida, and I do remember on the airplane there being a smoking section and a non-smoking section. But if you're younger than me, and this does not resonate with you, then I suspect you at least remember as a kid going to a restaurant where you chose smoking or non-smoking, right? That was very much a social norm. And we don't see that same norm today, right? I'm not choosing smoking or non-smoking when I go into a restaurant because we know that by eliminating smoking, we significantly reduce the risk of a whole host of negative health outcomes. And so that's our recommendation to families that has changed over time. And so I would ask that we consider spanking and corporal punishment along these same lines. So I was spanked and turned out fine. Well, sure you did. Or did you, right? So we slept prone as infants, sat in smoke-filled bars, rode without seatbelts. But all of those things did increase my risk for certain harms. And so now that we know the dangers of spanking, we must consider recommending in a different way. Okay. In child abuse and neglect, actually, their hallmark article of the year about 9 years ago actually was this one, which talks about spanking as an adverse childhood experience and puts it into that context. I'm sure we're all familiar with ACEs at this point in time. And so, adding in ACEs and seeing an increase in suicide attempts, rates of alcoholism, substance abuse, et cetera, and that's even after controlling for physical and emotional abuse. All right, so now we're going to address the religious argument. And again, I am not an expert. There is a 4-page article that will be in the references, and it's called Working with Molly. It's written by Victor Veith, who is very widely published in this particular area. And here we can see on top the born again Christian group compared to not born again Christians, and a higher percentage agreeing that spanking is acceptable, although with both groups declining over time. And what we're talking about is this phrase, spare the rod, spoil the child. And here are a couple of the references for you. But actually, spare the rod, spoil the child is not actually found in the Bible. It's a paraphrase for a verse from Proverbs. Those who spare the rod hate their children, but those who love them are diligent to discipline them. And so the literal spare the rod, spoil the child is used primarily by conservative evangelical Christian groups who believe that the Bible demands corporal punishment and concerns that any sort of dismissive approach is a slippery slope. And so the rod is a really interesting word and perhaps one of the most misinterpreted words in the Bible. And when I hear of a rod, I'm thinking of the shepherd with the stick whacking the sheep. But actually, the rod is the curved end of the shepherd's staff used to pull sheep out of dangerous situations if they get stuck in brush or fall into the river. And so it actually is meant as a symbol, a protective symbol of God's love. Um, and so rod occurs in the Bible with the Hebrew word musar. Typically, they're found together. And musar can be interpreted as a stick, a scepter, a lance, or a spear, but it also can be interpreted as an idea of physical or oral reproof or knowledge to be mastered. And so, in working with families who have this conservative, literal framework, it is helpful to point out that there are alternative definitions and interpretations that would permit them to be within Scripture. And it's also interesting that there is lots and lots of Scripture supporting corporal punishment of adults. And typically, well, I would say uniformly, we see that as a sign of the times, right? So while there were whippings and cutting off hands for transgressions back in the times of Solomon, those sort of transgressions are now treated with jail or fines or that sort of thing. We would no longer recommend wine for severe pain, right? We have better medicines, modern medicines, rather than using the things that are referred to in the Bible. Additionally, the modern concept of spanking is actually not found in the Bible. Really, it's stripes and more severe practices that would more typically result in injury. And so the modern smack on the buttocks with a hand is really not found in the Bible. And so choosing an alternative does not equate to being dismissive of Scripture. And again, I'd encourage you to read the Working with Molly. It's a 4-pager and it's an awesome discussion of this particular justification for corporal punishment. So what about this? This whole like kids will run wild with corporal punishment. So corporal punishment's illegal in 68 countries. You'll see those primarily in yellow. This is a little bit older, so a couple of states aren't accounted for, but generally the countries in yellow. And so here's a list. And essentially, if this were indeed the truth, we would expect more violence amongst youth in countries that had bans on corporal punishment. But when we looked at teens from 88 countries, over close to 500,000, we found 69% the rate of frequent fighting for boys in full ban countries as opposed to no ban countries, and 42% the rate of frequent fighting for girls in full ban countries versus no ban countries. And so actually, countries that have bans on corporal punishment are, in fact, were found to be less violent for youth. If you'd like to look up this Vox, I just want to say I actually was born after 1972, but that's the year that's pulled up on this particular slide. And what we find is when we think about lots of the different high-risk activities that teens engage in, and granted, there are some newer ones that were not common in the 1970s, but actually teenagers are generally better behaved these days, especially when it comes to things like teen pregnancy and smoking cigarettes and that sort of thing. Granted, there wasn't vaping happening in the 70s. And so, in summary, spanking's associated with reduced gray matter in the prefrontal cortex. It has the potential to impact IQ. It's associated with lots of negative health outcomes. It significantly increases the risk of physical abuse, and it can be considered an ACE. And alternatives to spanking are consistent with scripture. And there's actually less youth violence in countries that ban corporal punishment more. So I'm recognizing that I am being long-winded, and so I'm going to try to speed things up here. And so I think that we need to be really clear when we're talking to families that no hitting does not mean no discipline, right? So I think all of us recognize that parents or primary caregivers are their children's first and greatest teacher. And so all of these foundations of discipline are exceptionally important. So the consistency, the follow through, caregiver agreement. So there can't be different sets of rules depending on who's home at the time. That eye contact and touch. Age appropriate expectations. Again, I think this is really, really key. What is developmentally appropriate for that child? And then what can that parent expect in terms of behavior? Family meals. Does anyone have family meals anymore? I mean, it's hard. And also spending time together that is not digitally distracted is what I would say. So it's not just a meal, but it's a meal not with the TV on and everyone looking at their phone. So that connection. I love this particular pamphlet. You can get it on the Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky website. It's Ages and Stages, A Parent's Guide to Discipline, and helps kind of break this down. Also, as a part of the National No Hit Zone Committee, we have put together a 4-pager with QR codes by age, suggesting alternatives for common behaviors that might be encountered for that age that sometimes can escalate behavior that might potentially lead to spanking. And so it's really broken down by age. I'll just sort of hold this up, and this actually can be downloaded and looked at further on nohitzone.com. And I will encourage you to look at that website here shortly. And so, discipline for infants, learning about normal development, distraction, they don't have that object permanence, talking to families about coping with crying, and it's okay to step away. Because remember, 8% of households with kids under the age of 1 are reporting spanking in these little bitties. So young toddlers and older toddlers, preschool age group. So trying to create those safe spaces in the home. So if I'm putting the 2-year-old in the living room of my mother's house with the china figurines on the table and the corners of the coffee table, that is not a setup for success. Trying to say no sparingly and have few consistent safety related rules, right? Because if we're saying no all the time, no stops to really mean anything. And then I think we've all probably encountered that 18-month-old that one of their 2 words is no, right? Or one of their 10 words is no. And they've learned that from somewhere. I found that time out of objects has worked really well at my house. I had less success with time out. I think a lot of us pediatricians were trained on time out. Went great with my first child when I could focus my sole attention on them. But when I had a baby on a hip and was trying to fix dinner and be consistent with time out in that setting, it did not go well for me. But when I can make time out about objects, gosh, Buzz Lightyear keeps getting thrown on the floor. I don't want him to get hurt, so we're going to have him take a time out. Providing 2 choices, right? Do you want to brush your teeth first, or do you want to go to the bathroom first? Or let me count to, let's see how high I need to count before you can get X done, right? All those sorts of games. And then consistent routine, which is so hard with toddlers because there's stuff that parents need to get done, and they're still taking 2 naps a day, and that caregiver is oftentimes captive in their home. Time in, catching them being good, anticipating meltdowns and tantrums, and then putting words to feelings. School age, house rules and consequences. I found that when we sat down to do house rules, the consequences that my kids came up with were actually much worse than what I would have even said. So we had to sort of work together. Natural consequences. Again, time in still being really important. Modeling conflict resolution. So if my partner and I are solving conflicts by escalating or by hitting, then perhaps that's not how I want to teach my child how to resolve conflict. And so being mindful of that. Teens and tweens, house rules again, online limits. Teens still need parent time in too, maybe even more so, encouraging positive choices, et cetera, et cetera. I know you guys all know this stuff. So no hit zones. I'll shift gears again. I'm going to spend about 5 minutes on no hit zones, which is an area that I've done a ton of work in. And I really think of no hit zones as primary prevention. So stopping child abuse or neglect before it happens. And I think we, as professionals who work with children and families, have a real opportunity to move this social norm when it comes to hitting children. And we can do so through no hit zones. So, what is a no hit zone? It's an environment in which no adult shall hit another adult, no adult shall hit a child, no child shall hit an adult, and no child shall hit another child. So, no hitting of anyone, period. And it's kept somewhat purposely kind of generic to apply to all settings and areas. This actually started in 2005 by Dr. Lolita McDavid at Rainbow Babies and Children's. I left there before it started, but we actually implemented a no-hit zone policy at Norton Children's in 2012. And I spent a good amount of time, several years after that, going around to all of the different pediatric offices within Norton and educating folks on the no-hit zone. Also spent a lot of time with U of L Family Practice and the University of Louisville pediatric practices at that point in time. And certainly over time, I think there is less visibility of this program due to construction, consolidation. There are many more practices now than there previously were. And so I would welcome, perhaps I would even challenge each of you, if a no-hit zone is not a visible present program in your particular setting, please reach out to me. I would be delighted to help either reinvigorate or start a no-hit zone within your office. And so why do we need no-hit zones? So again, that opportunity to take a stand. We know about this strong association between spanking and physical child abuse, as well as many other negative health outcomes. Social norms change, so just making it really clear about the public expectations for acceptable, safe behavior. It's low cost, it's really simple, it's easy to implement. I would invite you to go to nohitzone.com. If your phone's not already in your hand, take your phone out, go to nohitzone.com, and there's an entire toolkit. It's not intended for anyone to start from scratch. The sign itself that the No Hit Zone Committee, you just saw that blue stop sign, purposefully does not have any copyrights on it because we want it to be spread widely. So this is what you will see when you go to nohitzone.com. I would also invite you to become an advocate personally. So advocates are essentially those who are in keeping with the ideals of a no-hit zone, but perhaps do not work or live in a no-hit zone. Perhaps it's just not been started yet. I'd also invite you if you would like to make your home a no-hit home. It does not list your address, it lists your zip code, but if you would like to make your home a no-hit home, you're invited to register. And so you can see some of our statistics in terms of the number of advocates, registrations for no-hit zones, toolkit users, and how widespread it is. So these are no-hit zones across the country. These are advocates across the world. And this is sort of a combination clustering of advocates, schools, homes, and no-hit zones. And so I would say that the no-hit zone policy in most settings is really already consistent with existing nonviolence policies. Some organizations find some challenges when there are multi-layers of approval that are required. But there are examples of policy statements in that toolkit for child advocacy centers, for churches, for a general agency, for hospitals, et cetera. And again, it's kept generic somewhat on purpose, but just no hitting of any kind. And then another thing that's important, besides a policy statement, is to have a champion, which could be you. I also just want to shout out again to Dr. Lolita McDavid. I think it's really helpful if being the no-hit zone champion is written into a job assignment so that if that person leaves, that then hopefully that job assignment goes to someone else, just in terms of longevity. Really clear signage is important as well. We have this fantastic CARES program, and my understanding of the CARES program is that it was in response to kind of COVID times and concerns for those working within our facilities as far as violence toward us, as far as patients and whatnot. I would argue that the no hit zone stop sign sends a different message about corporal punishment and hitting. I think families that are in our facilities would understand those two different signs differently. This we share clean air. What does that mean? Is that about pollution? Is that about smoking? So I think clear signage is really important. Examples of different signs. And a sign can be as simple as printing out a piece of paper from the No Hit Zone website and taping it to the wall. Lots of training materials. I'm happy to come give a training anytime you would like over Zoom, or potentially even in person. And I actually have on Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky's website, there's actually a video of me giving the training, so that can be utilized. Here is that 4-pager that I talked about. There are caregiver resources in no-hit zones. There's a parenting pledge that parents can take. I'll just briefly mention no-hit homes because, again, the idea being moving toward that AAP policy statement where there's no hitting happening in homes either. And perhaps when we're talking to families about baby proofing their home, there's a long checklist of things that is easily found on a website or even in some of our Bright Futures checklists. What if we add no hit zone or no hit home to our baby proofing safety talk? So I don't know if that's a part of your template in Epic, but it might be worth considering doing so. Okay, so I am going to, I think, wrap up. The Jefferson County Family Court is a no-hit zone. I'm actually talking to the mayor's office here coming up this week about potentially having some different city buildings declared as no-hit zones. There was a collaborative with the Louisville Bats. In Stoughton, Wisconsin, there are no-hit zones in all city buildings. Reverend Daryl Armstrong started the very first church that was declared a no-hit zones, and so just lots and lots of application. Revving up schools as no-hit zones. And I'll just end there. I'd be delighted to answer any questions. I know I'm close to end of time, so thank you so much for your attention. If you'd like to reach me, there's my email.
All right, thank you, Dr. Doc. Question, so Kentucky has not banned corporal punishment in schools, but the districts have policies. Is that true?
Correct. So the KDE, Kentucky Department of Education, within the last couple of years passed a regulation that required a couple of different things. Number one, for all public school districts to declare whether they permitted corporal punishment or did not, because some did, some didn't, and some were unclear. So it set a timeline on when school boards had to be clear about their policy when it came to this particular issue. And then it set forth a whole series of steps that had to be in place if a district decided to use corporal punishment. Because what the KDE acknowledged is that trauma-informed schools and using corporal punishment really cannot sit in the same room together, right? I mean, they really are opposing practices. And so it required things like calling the parent to request permission. It included that child who received corporal punishment had to be seen by a mental health provider within 24 hours to try to undo the trauma of the act of corporal punishment. And so I think the plan that was laid out helped move the needle on school districts that were using corporal punishment and maybe help them rethink about corporal punishment in a trauma-informed lens.
All right, thanks for that clarification.